Hello everyone and welcome back to a brand new Pokemon TCG video. Today we're going to be taking a look at a deck revolving around the Dragon type Mega Rayquaza EX. This is a very powerful Pokemon, however it's just also very energetically expensive to set up, but we're going to try and make this deck work regardless. So the Mega Rayquaza EX has a massive attack, hits for a lot of damage, requires a lot of energy cards, discards a lot of energy cards, so it's a bit of a double-edged sword. However, I will say that once the Mega Rayquaza EX is set up, it's just such a menacing and very difficult Pokemon to deal with. So anyways, Mega Rayquaza EX has the Dragon Ascent attack, allowing us to hit for up to 300 damage for a single, for 5 energy cards. The energy cards are pretty specific as well, so unfortunately it's not just like we can grab onto a whole ton of double colorless energies, repeatedly attach them to the Mega Rayquaza EX, and then we can get going very quickly. However, the Roaring Sky set has brought with us the double Dragon energy, which is going to help us tremendously with the attachments, with the energy attachments required to get the Mega Rayquaza EX going. Anyways, one last thing that I want to mention about the Mega Rayquaza EX is that it has the Delta Wild ability, allowing us to reduce the amount of damage that it takes by 20 from any grass, fire, water, or lightning type Pokemon. So Mega Rayquaza EX is not a Pokemon that should ever be underestimated. It has a massive 230 HP, and it also has some natural built-in insulation. I feel like this is a Pokemon that has a lot of potential, but it's also very energetically expensive, so it does require quite a bit of support to really make this type of deck work. One of those support cards are going to be the Mega Turbo item card, allowing us to look for any discarded basic energy cards from our discard pile and then attaching them to one of our Mega Evolution Pokemon. This is going to help out the Mega Rayquaza EX tremendously, given the fact that we have to repeatedly discard a energy card from our from the Mega Rayquaza EX whenever using the Dragon Ascent ability. Well, 2 of them actually. So Mega Turbo is going to help alleviate that strain by just a little bit. So we are running 2 copies of the Mega Turbo in our deck. We're also running, of course, the 4 copies of the Double Dragon Energy, which has come out with the Roaring Sky set. I feel like this is what is really going to give the Dragon type Pokemon a huge amount of competitive potential. This will allow us to, this is pretty much like a double Rainbow Energy without any sorts of drawbacks, but it's very specific that this can only be attached to Dragon type Pokemon. So Dragon type Pokemon have a huge energy support, and this is going to help out the Mega Rayquaza EX tremendously. We're running 4 copies of the Double Dragon Energy. Highly recommended, guys. Don't really feel like Double Dragon Energy can be substituted really for any other energy cards in this deck. But of course, unfortunately, we're only restricted to 4 special energies of a given type in any deck. Otherwise, I probably would have completely overloaded our deck with the Double Dragon Energy. Anyways, getting on to some of the other Pokemon that we are running in our deck, guys. We are running a total of 2 copies of the Reshiram. Again, this is another Pokemon that's going to help us with the setup of the Mega Rayquaza EX. With its TurboBlaze ability, we are able to attach a Fire Energy card from our hand to one of our Dragon type Pokemon. So Reshiram is a very nice Pokemon to include. We're running 2 copies of him in our deck. We're also running a total of 2 copies of the brand new Roaring Skies Hydreigon EX with its Dragon Road ability, provided that there is a Stadium card in play, which usually is very common. I mean, there's almost always going to be a Stadium card in play during any given battle, unless the opponent is running, for example, a Primal Groudon EX deck or a Donphan deck. But aside from that, it's very unusual not to have a Stadium card in play. Anyway, so Dragon Road, what it does is that it allows our Dragon type Pokemon in play to have 2 less energy costs required for them to be able to retreat. So that's pretty nice. It's going to allow our Mega Rayquaza EX, Rayquaza EX, and the Reshiram we are running in our deck to freely retreat. Hydreigon EX, unfortunately, is a little bit bulky, so it does require 1 energy card to be able to retreat. If the Dragon Road ability is, of course, in play, and also the regular Rayquaza, which we are running in our deck, which also would require an energy card to be able to retreat. Again, it's a bit of a bulky Pokemon, but that's okay. That Dragon Road ability is going to help us out a great deal. So we are running a single copy of the, 2 copies of the Rayquaza in our deck, guys. This is going to be our main attacker while we are setting up the Mega Rayquaza EX. So mainly we're going to be focusing on using the Dragon Pulse attack. So it does seem like it's a bit of a big price to pay, but I mean for 40 damage and a single energy card, a very solid 120 HP Pokemon, I feel like it's a very worthwhile Pokemon to include in this sort of deck. Also, one thing that I do want to mention is that Dragon Pulse can actually help us. I mean, if we're able to get some of our energy cards into the discard pile using this attack, and then we can go right ahead and use the Mega Turbo item card to retrieve those discarded energy cards and then attach them to the Mega Rayquaza EX. So I feel like it's a bit of a double-edged sword, but again, we can sort of make it work to our favor. Shred is another very solid attack, which we don't really want to use unless we're facing, for example, a safeguard type Pokemon or something like that that we'd like to be able to get rid of. So again, we're running 2 copies of the Rayquaza in our deck, just a very, very solid Pokemon. You guys could potentially swap him out for some other cards, an additional Reshiram, things like that, but I really like the inclusion of this card in our deck. So we'll be running 2 copies of him. I also briefly want to talk about the regular Rayquaza EX. I mean, the entire goal of our deck is to evolve it into the Mega Rayquaza EX. However, it has some pretty solid attacks, and from time to time, I mean, we don't really want to always use the Dragon Ascent attack, especially if we are facing a deck that doesn't run a whole lot of EX Pokemon. So in those sorts of situations, we could potentially use any of our Rayquaza EX's attacks by bringing out a Shrine of Memories Stadium card at play. So Shrine of Memories is a very nice card. This allows us to use any of our previous evolved Pokemon's attacks. So that means Mega Rayquaza EX can use the Rayquaza EX's attacks, which again is very, very useful just because Dragon Ascent is so energetically expensive, and also the fact, of course, that we don't always want to discard 2 energy cards whenever attacking with the Mega Rayquaza EX. So we're running 3 copies of the Shrine of Memories Stadium card. I feel like it works just very, very well with this type of deck. The other cards we are running in our deck, guys, we're running a single Dowsing Machine as the A-Spec card. This is just because we have a pretty big emphasis on a lot of our item type cards, and of course our trainer type cards as well, but I feel like more so our item type cards. Cards such as the Mega Turbo, the Professor's Letter, the Ultra Balls, things like that. So Dowsing Machine, I felt like was the way to go. You guys could potentially swap it out for the Computer Search, but again, I feel like Dowsing Machine seems to be the much better card, especially in combination with the Mega Rayquaza EX deck. Mega Rayquaza EX deck that we are taking a look at right now. Some other cards in our deck, guys, we are running a single Escape Rope. Reason why I have not included any switch cards is because Hydreigon EX is basically a built-in switch card. Escape Rope is going to allow us to freely switch in between our Pokemon as well, but the other really nice thing about Escape Rope is that it forces our opponent to switch his active Pokemon with one of his bench Pokemon as well. Depending on the situation, this can be a very, very potent card. So we are running this in our deck. We're also running a single copy of the Professor's Letter just to allow us to grab onto 2 of our basic energy cards. We're not running a whole ton of energy cards, and just because we'll frequently be discarding a lot into the discard pile, I feel like Professor's Letter is just a very nice, worthwhile card to include in our deck as well. So we are running a single copy of this. Now, bring ourselves back to the Rayquaza's Dragon Pulse attack, which forces us to discard the top 2 cards in our deck. Now, if we do use this attack, chances are we could get one of our basic Pokemon into the discard pile, such as the Rayquaza EX, Hydreigon EX, things like that. So to compensate for that a little bit, we are running a single copy of the Revive card. This allows us to put a basic Pokemon from our discard pile into our bench. Another nice thing that I want to mention about the Revive card, which we're not particularly doing in this deck, but we could, is that if we were to run some Battle Compressors, we could easily get some of our basic Pokemon into the discard pile, and then we can use the Revive to retrieve them and then put them back into the bench. So that's a pretty cool strategy, something that you guys should keep in mind. I feel like Revive is actually a very useful card. Probably going to be seeing it in action quite a bit in a lot of competitive decks that you guys will be seeing. Anyways, in our case, we're running a single copy of this card. We're also running a single copy of the Startling Megaphone. This allows us to discard all Pokemon tool cards attached to each of our opponent's Pokemon. Mainly speaking, this is to allow us to deal with those Garbodor's Garbotoxin abilities, but nonetheless, Startling Megaphone is just another very solid card to allow us to get rid of cards such as the Muscle Band, things like that. So we are running a single copy of this in our deck. The other cards in our deck are pretty self-explanatory. I'm going to be going through them very quickly. One card that I did want to mention before I quickly go through the other cards is the Hard Charm Pokemon Tool cards. This allows us to attach it to any of our Pokemon, and then that Pokemon takes 20 less damage from any of our opponent's attacks. Now again, as you guys know, the Mega Rayquaza EX has the built-in Delta Wild ability, and especially if we're facing a Water, Grass, Fire, or Lightning type deck, Heart Charm can allow us for some further insulation, making that Mega Rayquaza EX a very potent Pokemon. So we're running a total of 2 copies of the Heart Charm. Again though, ideally we'd like to attach the Rayquaza Spirit Link. However, that's not always possible, and in certain cases Heart Charm may even trump over that card. So we are running a total of 2 copies of the Heart Charm. Not really sure how worthwhile of a card it is. Feel free to play around with that, guys. Could potentially be substituted for some more useful cards, but in our case we are going to be sticking with a total of 2 copies of the Heart Charm in our deck. Some other cards that we are running, guys, 3 copies of the Ultra Ball to allow us to get any of the Pokemon that we need, 3 VS Seekers allowing us to reuse any of our supporter type cards, 2 Colresses, 4 Ends, and 4 Junipers for some draw support, 2 Lysandres allowing us to lure out any of our opponent's bench Pokemon, a single Lysandre trump card allowing us to reuse our cards all over again, 1 Teammates card, which can really come in handy as well, 3 Rayquaza Spirit Links, 3 Shrine of Spirits, 2 Heart Charms, and a total of 13 energy cards. 6 of them are Fire Energies, 3 of them are the Lightning Energy, and 4 of them the Double Dragon Energy. So with that, we are going to go and see what this deck is capable of. I've played very little games with it right now, but this deck has been performing quite well. I feel like it's ready to showcase to you guys. Again though, it could potentially need quite a bit of modifications here and there, so feel free to play around with it. I don't feel like this is the final sort of copy of this deck, so I'll be playing around with it as well, guys, potentially tweaking it up here and there. Anyways, looks like we have found ourselves an opponent, and it's going to be a Fire, Psychic, and Steel type deck. Not really sure what that's going to entail. I'm assuming though that the Steel type deck is most likely going to be the Jirachi EX, but again I'm not really sure. Anyways, let's start off by bringing out the Reshiram as our active Pokemon. We'll be able to make use of that TurboBlaze ability right away, so that's very cool. Let's go and bring out a Rayquaza EX on our bench as well. And looks like we are going to see the Cobalion EX, so let's go and attach a Rayquaza Spirit Link to the Rayquaza. I will be using the TurboBlaze to attach a Fire Energy card to the Rayquaza. We'll be attaching a Lightning Energy card to him as well, using the N for some new cards in our hand. Let's go and lay down another Rayquaza EX on our bench, and then we're gonna go and end our turn. So we have a Rayquaza EX in our hand, so that's very cool. Hopefully we can draw onto another draw supporter type card in our next turn, guys. We're running quite a few in our deck. We're seeing the Startling Megaphone. Thankfully we have another Rayquaza Spirit Link in our hand, so that's pretty nice. So we will be bringing out the Mega Rayquaza EX. Let's go and attach the Rayquaza Spirit Link, bring out the Mega Rayquaza EX, and then I'm gonna go and attach a Double Dragon Energy. Could potentially get Lysandre out, and the Righteous Edge could force us to discard that card. So I'm gonna go and temporarily just attach a Lightning Energy card to the Mega Rayquaza EX, and then we're gonna go and end our turn. So it looks like the opponent is also running a Mega Aggron EX deck as well. So we're gonna see which one of our Mega Pokemon is able to sort of outdo the other. Again, Mega Rayquaza EX is a very menacing Pokemon as well, though, just because it can hit us for potentially 240 damage. I mean, that's a massive amount of damage, guys. Not a Pokemon that should by any means be underestimated. Again, I'm a little bit unsure whether or not I would like to play the Double Dragon Energy just yet, so I'm going to go and attach another Fire Energy card to the Mega Rayquaza EX, and then we're going to go and end our turn once again. Reshiram is slowly getting knocked out, taking that damage accumulation. That Aggron EX is slowly getting loaded up as well. Hopefully we can take care of him before he becomes too menacing. So we do have the Shrine of Memories card. And, we can't retreat the Reshiram just yet. So I'm just going to go and end our turn once again. I could, however, lay down the Shrine of Memories card during our next turn, use the Ultra Ball to discard the Startling Megaphone and another card in our hand, and then I should be able to retreat the Reshiram to attack with the Mega Rayquaza EX. Alright, so I think that's what I'm going to go and do, guys. So let's go and get rid of the Rayquaza from our hand, the Startling Megaphone as well. Hopefully I don't regret it, because it would have been nice to get rid of an Aggron Spirit Link, but we don't see that out in play just yet. So let's go and get rid of those 2 cards in our hand. Look for the Hydreigon EX, lay him down into the bench, and now we don't have the free retreat cost just yet, guys, until we actually lay down the Shrine of Memories card. So that's something that you guys need to keep in mind. I really want to dig it into you guys. So let's go and retreat that Reshiram, bring out the Mega Rayquaza EX, and finally start dealing a whole ton of damage. Let's go and use the Dragon Ascent, give up a Fire Energy card and a Lightning Energy card as well, and then we're gonna go and draw onto 2 of our prize cards. So as you guys can see, that Mega Rayquaza EX is already very menacing. That TurboBlaze ability certainly did help set up the Mega Rayquaza EX just a little bit earlier. Double Dragon Energy as well, another very useful card. I don't think our opponent's Aggron EX is going to be able to take care of the Mega Rayquaza EX just yet, unless we do see a Mega Aggron EX come out, but we are just seeing a Steel Headbutt attack. It's only going to hit us for a maximum of 80 damage. We unfortunately don't have any steel insulation, but that's okay. We should hopefully be able to get rid of our opponent's Mega Aggron EX. So I'm going to go and use the N for some new cards in our hand. Awesome, looks like we have the Mega Turbo card, so I'm going to go and use it to look for a Fire Energy card, attach it to the Mega Rayquaza EX. Let's go and use the Dragon Ascent one more time, and my goodness, that Mega Rayquaza EX is just wreaking havoc on our opponent. Let's go and discard 2 energy cards once again, draw onto 2 more prize cards. And yeah, so things are not looking good whatsoever for our opponent right now. We're just tearing through his deck. So again, this is why I feel like this Mega Rayquaza EX should not be underestimated, but I still feel like the other one is a much more solid Pokemon on the whole. We're seeing a Steel Shelter card, Shauna for some new cards in our opponent's hand. I mean, I'm probably going to go and lay down a Shrine of Memory cards just so that we can attack once again. We only have some ends. Not particularly useful, so let's go and lay down a Shrine of Memories card. I'm going to go and attach a Fire Energy card to the Mega Rayquaza EX. And yeah, let's go and use the Juniper for some new cards in our hand. There's no way that the N would have been a good move with respects to that particular turn. So let's go and use the Dragon Strike attack, knock out our opponent's Victini, and then draw onto another one of our prize cards. So that's why the Shrine of Memories is just such a useful card. Otherwise, that means that we would have had to end our turn, and the Mega Rayquaza EX would not have been able to attack. So it looks like we're going to be able to win just that early. Our opponent is going to quit before we go on to the final knockout. I feel like you guys have a pretty good understanding what this deck is capable of, but again, that match was just so quick. I feel like we should go and find ourselves another opponent again. I have to say though that this deck has been impressing me a lot. I mean, it's just been built in its initial stages, and I've only made a single modification to it, in that I had initially forgotten to include the Hydreigon EX in our deck, and it's just such a worthwhile addition, just allowing us to have a bit of more lenient retreating in between our Pokemon, and even some absolutely free retreating, of course, provided that a stadium card happens to be in play. So I'm going to go and use the Tails, and awesome, looks like we're going to go and start first. Also guys, I do want to say that the Hydreigon EX could potentially be swapped out for a Darkrai EX, but the one thing about Darkrai EX is that that would entail that our Mega Rayquaza EX specifically has a double Dragon Energy card attached to it. I feel like that would be a little bit more restrictive as opposed to the Hydreigon EX. But again, you guys are free to play around with that and sort of see how things go. So I'm going to go and attach a Lightning Energy card to the Rayquaza, use the N for some new cards in our hand. Let's go and bring out I accidentally clicked on that Ultra Ball, 2 Rayquaza EXs onto our bench, and then I'm going to go and end the turn. Don't think our opponent's Deoxys should be able to really hit us for any damage just yet, so I'm going to hold on to the Hard Charm in our hand for the time being. We're seeing a Dive Ball, a whole ton of Keldeo EXs on our opponent's bench. I'm assuming though that the Deoxys is mainly used for some draw support, which is perfectly understandable. I mean, it is a very solid Pokemon with respects to that. I don't really think our opponent is running any Psychic type Pokemon, otherwise I would have considered insulating our Rayquaza. But for now, let's go and bring out a Reshiram, and then I'm going to go and attach a Lightning Energy card to the Rayquaza EX. Let's go and use Dragon Pulse, hit our opponent for 40 damage, and then discard 2 cards into our discard pile. So a double Dragon Energy and a Shrine of Memories. That's a little bit unfortunate, but we do have the Lysandres trump card, so I'm not particularly worried about that. Seeing another Dive Ball again could potentially... Okay, so I was assuming we could have potentially seen the Blastoise and the Rare Candy come out, but the opponent is slowly loading up his strategy. Those Keldeo EXs can very quickly become menacing Pokemon. One thing though that I really like about the Mega Rayquaza EX again is that we have the Delta Wild ability. The opponent is going to use the Pokemon Catcher, flip the tail, so that's positive thing for us. But anyways, getting back to Delta Wild, what it does is that it reduces the damage output of our opponent's water type Pokemon by up to 20 damage. So I feel like that's something that is just very, very nice. Let's go and attack with the Rayquaza's Dragon Pulse attack once again and get 2 more cards into the discard pile. Wow, so we have 2 of our Shrine of Memories and a Juniper into the discard pile as well. I mean, Dragon Pulse, again, as I mentioned earlier, guys, it is a bit of a double-edged sword. but we're going to try and make do with it regardless. So we're seeing 2 water energy cards from our opponent's deck due to the Professor's Letter. So Rayquaza is probably going to get knocked out. That Keldeo EX is probably going to hit us for 130 damage. Currently it can hit for up to 110 damage. Our opponent does need to attach another water energy card to him, and looks like that is going to happen. So Rayquaza is unfortunately going to get knocked out. Let's go and temporarily bring out the Reshiram as our active Pokemon. And awesome, okay, so we do have the VS Seeker. I will be using that to grab into the Professor Juniper. So let's go and attach the Heart Charm. I'm gonna go and attach the Heart Charm to one of our Rayquaza EXs. I feel like it could be useful later on. Let's go and use the Ultra Ball to discard the Shrine of Memories card and the Revive card as well. Yeah, so let's go and do that. And I'm going to go and look for a Hydreigon EX to allow us to freely retreat. Possibly the other, yeah, let's go and bring out the Hydreigon EX for the time being, guys. We'll be laying him down using the VS Seeker to grab onto the Juniper, and then looking for some new cards in our hand. Awesome, looks like we have a Mega Rayquaza EX in our hand. I'm gonna go and lay down a regular Rayquaza EX. Gonna go and use the TurboBlaze to attach a Fire Energy card to the Rayquaza EX that already has an energy card attached to it. And then let's go and bring out the Mega Rayquaza EX, which should hopefully take care of our opponent's Keldeo EX during our next turn. Hopefully if our Reshiram doesn't get knocked out, but I mean, even if it does, guys, I could use the Teammates card to look for the Turbo Flare, what's it called? Sorry, Mega Turbo card, and then look for a discarded energy card, attach it to our Mega Rayquaza EX, and then take care of our opponent's Keldeo EX. So let's go and use the Teammates card, look for a Mega Turbo card. Let me see how many cards we have in the discard pile, guys. So just a single energy card, but I'm gonna go and look for 2 Mega Turbo cards. Because again, after using the Mega Rayquaza EX's attack, we're going to be discarding 2 energy cards into the discard pile. So let's go and grab those and then put them into our hand. Attach a Double Dragon energy to the Mega Rayquaza EX, Mega Turbo, and then we're going to go and use the Dragon Ascent, knock out our opponent's Keldeo EX for massive 300 damage, and then we're going to go get rid of 2 of our energy cards into the discard pile and draw onto 2 prize cards. So I really don't think any of our opponent's Pokemon would be able to knock out our Mega Rayquaza EX just yet. A massive 230 damage, and our opponent would have to hit us specifically for 250 damage, again, just because of that Delta Wild ability card. So we're seeing this pure energy retrieval, so I feel like the Keldeo EX is going to hit us for a whole ton of damage, but probably not enough damage to knock out the Mega Rayquaza EX. I mean, if the opponent's Keldeo EX is somehow able to knock out our Mega Rayquaza EX with a single attack, I'm going to be very impressed, because that's going to require a whole ton of energy cards. But chances are we're probably not going to see that much damage being dealt to the Mega Rayquaza EX. Currently, the opponent can hit for 150 damage, minus 20 damage due to the Delta Wild ability. And we'll be able to attack again with the Mega Rayquaza EX. So, alright, so 5 energy cards, so that is 100 damage, 150 damage, yeah. So again, not enough to hit us for a knockout just yet. So I'm probably going to go, okay, so another Superior Energy Retrieval, but that's a single energy card in the opponent's discard pile. So that's not going to be all that useful for the opponent, I don't think. Currently, Keldeo EX can hit us for 150 damage. We're seeing the the Scoop Up Cyclone. Opponent is really trying to rack up the damage on our Mega Rayquaza EX. Again, though, I feel like it's lacking just a little bit. Okay, so we're seeing a Shaman EX. Opponent really wants to take care of our Mega Rayquaza EX with a single attack, and I don't really blame him. I mean, Mega Rayquaza EX is just such a fearsome Pokemon. 300 damage. 8 energy cards, my goodness, 160 plus 50, 210 damage right now, minus 20, so 190 damage that our opponent's Keldeo EX could currently hit the Mega Rayquaza EX for. Again, lacking by 40 damage. If we see 2 more water energy cards attached to our opponent's Keldeo EX, then we would see a 1-turn knockout, and that would just be absolutely devastating. So that's quite positive for us. Looks like the Mega Rayquaza EX is indeed going to be able to survive. So I'm going to go and use the Mega Turbo to look for an energy card and attach it to the Rayquaza EX. Mega Rayquaza EX, attach a Fire Energy card to him as well, and then let's go and use the Colress for some new cards in our hand. Let's go and bring out another one of the Mega Rayquaza EXs, guys. I'm also going to use The Ultra Ball, I mean, Mega Rayquaza EX is probably going to get knocked out during our next turn, so let's go and use it to get rid of the N and the Lysandre in our hand and temporarily bring out the Reshiram. Because I mean, what I'm thinking, guys, is that if our Mega Rayquaza EX happens to get knocked out, I'm going to go and bring out the Reshiram, attach the Lightning Energy to the Mega Rayquaza EX, and then hopefully I can make use of the TurboBlaze ability as well. So let's go and knock out our opponent's Keldeo EX and draw onto 2 more prize cards. Let's go and get rid of a Lightning and a Fire Energy card, and then draw onto 2 more of our prize cards. Awesome, looks like we're able to draw onto a Heart Charm card as well. Could potentially prolong our Reshiram's life by just a little bit, but again, I'm not really sure just yet. But if our opponent is able to look for 3 water energy cards, then that Keldeo EX would be able to hit for more than enough damage to knock out our Keldeo EX. So we are seeing a Juniper. Our opponent has a whole ton of energy cards into the discard pile, and he probably has quite a few more superior energy retrievals in his deck. I'm assuming he is running the maximum copy, but we're seeing 2 Professor's Letters come out, 2 energy cards getting attached to our opponent's Keldeo EX. So yeah, chances are our Mega Rayquaza EX is probably, yeah, so our Mega Rayquaza EX is going to get knocked out during this turn. Hopefully we can load up our benched Mega Rayquaza EX. So let's go and temporarily bring out the Reshiram as our active Pokemon. Guys, I will be attaching the Heart Charm to him. Awesome, looks like we've just been able to draw onto a Fire Energy card. Let's go and use Turbo Blaze to attach a Fire Energy card to the Mega Rayquaza EX, a Lightning Energy card to him as well. Use the Juniper for some new cards in our hand, and then I have to go and end our turn, I believe. Yeah, so unfortunately I'm gonna have to go and end our turn, guys. Don't think our Reshiram will get knocked out during this turn, but again, I'm not really sure. Currently, Keldeo EX can hit for 110 damage, minus 20 damage insulation, so 130 damage right now. Sorry, 110, of course, given that we have some insulation. 1 more water energy card, and it would be able to knock out our Reshiram with a single attack. We are seeing a Skyla, so yeah, it looks like our Reshiram is probably going to get knocked out during this turn, guys. I think I'm gonna have to bring out the Mega Rayquaza EX and really hope for the best. Just a very, very tight game, guys. Hopefully we can still win. The opponent, though, has a pretty menacing deck as well. That Shaymin EX, just such a useful card. I'm hoping still to grab onto a couple more of them, guys. They seem to be very, very expensive right now. So hopefully I can grab onto a couple of those. Let's go and bring out the Mega Rayquaza EX as our active Pokemon for the time being. Okay, so I could use the Lysandres trump card. I'm not really sure what I would like to use right now, guys. Alright, so I'm gonna go and attach a Fire Energy card to the Mega Rayquaza EX. I don't know how many more energy cards we have in our deck, so let me see. So we have quite a few energy cards into the discard pile. So 2 of our Double Dragon energies, a couple of Fire and Lightning energy cards. Should I use the Juniper, the Lysandres trump card? Sorry guys, I'm really trying to think, because again, this could potentially decide the outcome of the game. I have a lot of options right now. One of them is I'm going to go and attach the Spirit Link to the Rayquaza EX. And you know what, I think I'm going to go for the Juniper. I'm really hoping that this is the right choice, guys. But again, I'm not entirely sure. So let's go and bring out another Mega Rayquaza EX. And then unfortunately I can't attack just yet, so I'm gonna have to go and end the turn. If the opponent does have the Lysandre, that could unfortunately spell the end for us. I mean, currently that Keldeo EX can hit for 170 damage. Our Hydreigon EX does have 180 HP, so if we do see a Lysandre come out, maybe we're still able to win. Maybe using the N was the right choice, guys. Again, I'm not really sure. But nonetheless, if our opponent is able to defeat us, I feel like this was a very good game, and our opponent would have rightfully deserved it. But again, we'll see. I feel like it's still a little bit too early to determine. Currently that Keldeo EX can hit for 120, 50, 170 damage, minus 20 damage, so 150 damage. He would need 4 more water energy cards to be able to knock out the Mega Rayquaza EX. We're seeing the Tierno, so we're not going to see a Lysandre, so that's quite nice. I think we may just be able to take this game, guys. All I need to do is attach a Double Dragon Energy and knock out the opponent's Keldeo EX. So yeah, it looks like we are going to be able to win. Very close game. I have to give it to our opponent. good game, because I mean this was an excellent game right now. So let's go and knock out the opponents. Cal EX use the Dragon Ascent and then go on to the victory. So thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I really enjoy using this deck, and yeah, so I'll definitely have a lot more decks for you guys upcoming. If you guys did enjoy this video, please be sure to hit that like and subscribe button, and I will see you guys next time.